Brennan picked up the rifle from the table where Solis had set it down and turned it over in his hands the way a man turns over something he's trying to decide whether to laugh at. "This is your competition weapon," he said. "Not a question, a verdict." Sergeant First Class Quinn Avery didn't answer right away. She'd learned a long time ago that silence, held correctly, did more work than any sentence she could construct. She let him look at the rifle, let him take in the wooden stock, the manual bolt, the absence of any optic system more sophisticated than the iron sights her grandfather had fitted himself before Korea. Let him arrive at whatever conclusion he was going to arrive at without her assistance. "The M24 is the standard," Brennan said. "I know what the standard is," Quinn said. Her voice was level. "The specific level of a woman who has been having this conversation in one form or another for 11 years and has stopped spending energy on the parts that don't matter." Brennan set the rifle down. He looked at her with an expression she recognized from every pre-deployment briefing she'd attended where someone in the room had decided before she walked in that she was the variable they hadn't accounted for. "You cleared the baseline requirements," he said. "Personal weapons are authorized as long as they meet minimum spec." "They do," she said. He wrote something on his clipboard. The pen moved the way pens move when the person holding them is documenting something they want on record in case things go badly. Then he handed her the range assignment card and walked away, and Quinn stood in the processing bay at Fort Bragg's advanced marksmanship facility with her grandfather's rifle and the specific interior stillness of a woman who had been underestimated so many times it had stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like information. She'd driven down from Virginia in her own truck, arrived at ZO 540 40 minutes before processing opened, and sat in the parking lot with the rifle case across her lap, listening to the engine cool. There were things she did before she competed that she didn't explain to people and didn't need to. This was one of them, the stillness before the noise. The last few minutes of quiet before she walked into a room where every variable she hadn't controlled yet was already in motion. The Advanced Marksmanship Invitational ran once every 2 years and drew the top precision shooters from every branch. Active duty, reserve, and a small number of veterans who had been specifically invited based on historical performance records. Quinn was one of 3 veterans on the list. She was the only woman. She was 34 years old. She had deployed 4 times, twice to Afghanistan and twice to locations that didn't appear on her public service record. She had, in those deployments, made shots at distances and under conditions that she had never described in detail to anyone who hadn't been standing next to her when she made them, not out of modesty, out of the understanding that some things sounded improbable enough when they happened that describing them afterward only invited arguments she didn't have the patience for. Her grandfather had given her the rifle when she was 8. He was 62 years old at the time and had the hands of a man who had spent his life doing things that required precision. A watchmaker's hands, he said, which was accurate both literally and figuratively because he had been a watchmaker. And before that he had been something else entirely. Something he mentioned rarely and in pieces, the way men of his generation mentioned the things that had shaped them most. Korea, he'd say sometimes. The cold there. And then he wouldn't finish the sentence. Quinn had learned not to ask him to finish it. She learned instead to read the way his hands moved over the rifle when he cleaned it, and she understood from those hands everything she needed to know about where the rifle had been before it came to her. He was 87 now and still alive and living in the same house in western Pennsylvania where Quinn had grown up. She'd called him the morning she left. He'd asked if she was ready. She'd said she was. He'd said, "You know what you know, Quinn. Don't let anyone put doubt in the space between what you know and what you do." She'd told him that was a complicated thing to say for 6 in the morning. He'd laughed. He had a good laugh for an 87-year-old man. The competitor roster had 38 names on it. Quinn read it in the barracks that first evening and put a mental asterisk next to 3 of them. Captain David Fenwick, who had won this invitational twice and whose marksmanship record was the kind that got referenced in training manuals. Master Sergeant Colm Osee, who was 15 years into a career with the 75th Ranger Regiment and who she had heard described by someone whose opinion she respected as the most consistently accurate shooter currently in active service, and Staff Sergeant Nathan Bray. Bray she knew by reputation and also by a brief professional encounter 18 months earlier at a joint training exercise in Nevada, where he had demonstrated both exceptional technical skill and the specific quality of a man who believed that exceptional technical skill entitled him to a particular kind of standing in every room he entered. He was 29 years old and had the energy of someone who had been told he was special, often enough that he'd begun to organize his identity around it. That evening, unpacking in her assigned quarters, she heard his voice through the wall. The walls were standard government construction, which meant they transmitted sound the way walls do when no one has bothered to care about acoustics. She could make out his voice clearly and the voice of someone he was with, a younger operator she didn't recognize. "She's here with a bolt action," Bray said, an actual, like manually. Between shots, the other voice said something she couldn't hear. "No," Bray said, "not a modern one." I looked it up. "She's running a rifle that was built when Eisenhower was president." Another pause. "Someone should have told her this isn't a museum," Bray said. Quinn finished unpacking. She laid the rifle on the cot and sat beside it for a moment with her hand on the stock, on the specific grain of the wood she had memorized so thoroughly that she could identify it blindfolded. Her grandfather's hands had worn this surface to a particular smoothness. Her hands had added to it over 26 years. The rifle knew the shape of both of them. She thought about what Bray had said. She wasn't angry. Anger was a thing she had spent years relocating to a different position in her internal architecture, somewhere she could access it when she needed it and seal off when she didn't. What she felt was something quieter and more precise. The feeling of someone who has seen the first move in a pattern they recognize and is already several moves ahead. She laid down on the cot and was asleep in 4 minutes. The first qualification day started at a 700 with a standard prone series, 20 targets at distances from 200 to 600 yards, each scored on ring value. It was the kind of format that established baseline and sorted out anyone who had inflated their own reputation. Quinn had been shooting qualifications since she was 14 and had the particular relationship with them of someone who finds them neither frightening nor interesting, just necessary. A toll booth between the entrance and the actual road. She was assigned to lane 9. Bray was in lane 8. She went prone, settled her breathing, and began. The first target was at 200 yards. Through the iron sights, it was small in the way iron sights made targets small, which is to say it was exactly its actual size, with nothing added, nothing subtracted, no software telling her where to aim, no reticle calculating drift. Just the front post and the rear aperture, and the target and the light and her reading of all of them simultaneously. She fired. The scoring officer called 10. She cycled the bolt, acquired the second target. Beside her in lane 8, Bray's equipment made the specific sounds of sophisticated modern optics, the soft electronic tone of his scope's ballistic computer initializing, the controlled breathing of someone who had been trained to manage his heart rate through a systematic process. His first shot came 5 seconds after hers. The scoring officer called 9. Good, not perfect. Quinn's third shot was called 10. Her fourth, her fifth. By the time she reached the 400-yard targets, she was aware of a change in the quality of attention on the range. It was a subtle thing, the way attention has weight when enough people are directing it at the same point. The observation deck above the firing line had been sparsely populated at the start of the morning session. It was less sparse now. Fenwick was 3 lanes to her left. She could hear his shots at irregular intervals, the intervals of a man who took different amounts of time at a different distance, because the distances genuinely required different calculations, which was actually the correct approach. Fenwick shot 16 for 20 in the first qualification. It was a strong performance. The scoring officer noted it without ceremony. Quinn shot 20 for 20. She stood, cleared her weapon, and looked at her card when the scoring officer handed it back to her. Perfect score. She'd known before she looked. You always knew before you looked. The question was whether the day had given you any reason to doubt what you knew, and this day hadn't. On lane 8, Bray had shot 18 for 20. He was quiet when he stood, not the quiet of concentration, the quiet of recalibration. The afternoon session was timed acquisition. Targets appearing at random distances for 8-second windows, no announcement of which distance was next. You acquired, calculated, and fired inside the window or the target was gone. Quinn had been training for this format since she was deployed the first time and spent 3 weeks in a position where she had to engage targets that appeared without warning. At distances she estimated on the fly, because there was no time and no instrument between the target appearing and the decision to fire, she had estimated well. Men had come home because of it. She did not think about this during the qualification. She thought about the front post, the aperture, the light, the wind, and the specific quality of each distance as she felt it. 12 targets, 12 hits. The wind shifted between target 9 and target 10, and she accounted for it with a hold adjustment that moved her point of aim by a fraction that had no formal measurement but had a correct feeling she trusted more than any number. The range master, a chief warrant officer named Garvey, who had been running this facility for 9 years and had the eyes of a man who had developed strong opinions about what exceptional looked like, stood at the scoring station after she cleared her last target and looked at her card for what felt like a considered amount of time. 12 for 12, he said. Then he moved on. Sometimes that was the most complete thing a person could say. That evening, Quinn found O.C. in the mess hall and sat across from him without asking because she'd read his file and he'd read hers. And they were both the kind of people who recognized when the asking was unnecessary. He was 41, built like someone who had spent 2 decades doing things that required strength without vanity, and he had the quality that Quinn associated with men who had been genuinely good at something for long enough that they no longer needed anyone to confirm it. Brennan logged a flag on your weapon, O.C. said. I know. He's going to raise it in tomorrow's briefing. I know that too. O.C. ate in silence for a moment. Bray's been talking, he said. I know. He looked at her. You don't seem concerned. I'm very concerned, Quinn said. I'm just not going to let it show in my hands. He considered that. Your grandfather's rifle, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd read her file thoroughly enough. He carried it in Korea, she said. 38th parallel, 1951. 3 winters, and he came home. He came home, Quinn said. He said the rifle was the reason. O.C. was quiet. People here are saying the iron sights are a disadvantage. People here are right, Quinn said. They're a significant disadvantage at its standard distances. No magnification, no ballistic compensation, no electronic wind correction. She paused. The question is what they're right about and what they don't know they're wrong about yet. O.C. looked at her carefully. The look of a man who has been in enough serious situations to recognize when someone is telling him something real. What are they wrong about? When the conditions change, Quinn said, you want the instrument that doesn't fail. He held her gaze. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man filing something away for later. They ate in silence, and across the mess hall Bray was speaking at a volume calibrated to carry, and Quinn caught enough fragments to understand that he was constructing a narrative about what had happened today that centered on her score being a statistical anomaly. She didn't look over. She went back to her quarters and cleaned the rifle, which didn't need cleaning, and sat with it across her lap for a long time, and she thought about her grandfather's hands, and she thought about 1951 and what 3 winters at the 38th parallel meant for a man who had survived them. And she thought about the specific thing he had told her when she was 16 and had shot a difficult target at a difficult distance and come home proud. He had said, proud is fine for today. Tomorrow you have to earn it again. She had thought that was hard at 16. At 34, she understood it was the only sustainable model. The next morning's briefing began with exactly what O.C. had predicted. Brennan stood at the front of the room with his clipboard and went through the day's schedule, and then, with the specific energy of a man who has been asked to do something he was asked to do, raised the question of non-standard equipment. I want to note for the record, he said, that one competitor is using a manual bolt-action rifle without optics. This is within the rules. I want to confirm that all competitors understand the rules allow this and that no scoring adjustments will be made based on equipment. He didn't look at Quinn. the particular quality of not looking at someone when you're talking about them. Major Sandra Whitmore was the Invitational's senior presiding officer. She was 56, had served 28 years, and had the expression of someone who had presided over enough bureaucratic theater to have developed immunity to its dramatic effects. She looked at the room over the top of her reading glasses. "Moving on," she said. "Day 2 schedule." Bray raised his hand. "Ma'am, just for clarification, the non-standard equipment, is there a waiver process for others who might want to simplify their loadout?" The specific humor of the question traveled around the room without anyone acknowledging it. Some smiles were better concealed than others. Whitmore looked at Bray with the expression of a woman who had heard that joke before. "The equipment rules are in your briefing packet, Staff Sergeant," she said. "Page 4. She moved on. Bray sat back. He didn't look at Quinn. She noticed that specifically. The choice not to look was its own kind of contempt, the kind that declined to grant the target the dignity of acknowledgement. After the briefing, O.C. fell into step beside her on the way to the range. "Whitmore didn't flinch," he said. "No," Quinn said. "She's seen this before. Have you? 11 years' worth." He was quiet for a moment. "There's going to be an equipment phase tomorrow," he said. "Cold bore, 5 shots, minimum 700 yards. Group size, I know. At 700 yards with iron sights." "I know," she said again, and there was no edge in it, just the simple fact of someone who had already run the math. The morning's phase was a scenario format. Positions changing between shots, distances not announced until you were in position, time windows short enough to punish anything except immediate execution. The kind of format that tested whether your fundamentals were real or whether they'd been built by conditions too controlled to survive contact with variation. Quinn worked through it the way she worked through everything, one decision at a time, each one complete before the next began. There was a discipline her grandfather had called moment work, the practice of being entirely in the current moment rather than managing anxiety about the next one. He had learned it in Korea because the alternative had observable consequences. She had learned it from him at 12 and had spent 22 years refining it. Fenwick shot 11 of 14 and led the field until the scores were posted. Quinn had shot 14 of 14. The silence that followed the score posting had a particular texture, not surprise exactly, something more like recalibration. The sound of a room updating its model. On the way back from the range, she heard Bray's voice behind her. "Wind was low this morning," he said to someone beside him. "Good conditions for iron." Nobody responded. That was its own answer. That evening, she went to her equipment locker to retrieve a cleaning component and found it unlocked. She stood in the corridor for a moment and looked at the door, which was not broken, not forced, simply standing open the way a door stands when someone with a key has opened it, and not bothered to close it fully on the way out. She looked inside. Everything was present, but the rifle case had been moved. Precise in its replacement, nearly exact, the kind of nearly exact that was designed to be undetectable to anyone who hadn't memorized the original position down to the angle of the handle and the specific way the latches caught the overhead light. She had memorized it. She closed the locker carefully, walked to O.C.'s door, and knocked twice. He opened it. She said, "Someone was in my locker." He stepped back. She came in. "Nothing taken," she said, "but the case was moved. Deliberate. You're certain?" "I'm certain." She told him how she knew. He was quiet for a moment. "Bray, I don't have proof," she said. "I have a strong directional signal." "The facility master keys are controlled through range admin," O.C. said. "Garvey's team, which means someone either has authorization or has access to someone who does." He looked at her. "Are you going to report it?" "Not yet," she said. "One open locker and a moved case doesn't establish a pattern. If I report now, I look like I'm distracted. If I wait and it happens again, you have documentation. And whoever did it thinks it worked," she said. "That's useful." O.C. was quiet. He had the quality of a man who understood the difference between caution and passivity, and who could see that what she was describing was the former. "What do you need?" he said. "Right now, just someone to know," she said, "in case it escalates." He nodded. "Then I know," he said. She went back to her quarters and sat on the cot with the rifle, and she checked every component she could check by feel in the low light, and everything was where it should be. The rifle was fine. The rifle was always fine. 60 years of care from two sets of hands that understood it. She thought about her grandfather, not strategically, just genuinely, the way you think about someone when something real is happening and they're the person you would have told. He had never talked much about Korea. What he had told her came in small pieces over decades, the way things came out of men who had kept them inside long enough that the pieces had separated from the original shape. The cold, he said sometimes, the specific cold of the Taebaek Mountains in winter that didn't just lower your body temperature, but lowered your belief in warmth as a concept. And the rifle. He always came back to the rifle. He had saved 4 men with it on a night so cold that the more sophisticated weapons in his unit had malfunctioned. The cold had found their mechanisms and stiffened their tolerances, and when it mattered most, the things that were supposed to function had failed to function. His hadn't. His was simple enough that cold had no purchase on it. Afterward, the after-action report had described his performance as adequate. His commanding officer, a man whose name her grandfather remembered and never said without a specific quality of distance in his voice, had written those words in official documentation. Adequate under pressure. And that documentation had followed him home, had defined what the record said about him, while what had actually happened that night lived only in the memories of 3 men who knew and 1 who had not survived to know anything. Her grandfather had never applied for any correction to the record. He had said once when she asked him that the men who came home were the ones who already knew what they'd done. The men who didn't come home were the ones who needed the paper to prove it. He'd rather be in the first group. She had thought that was wisdom. She still did, but she also thought, at 34, that wisdom and justice were sometimes different things, and that accepting the first one too easily could prevent the second from arriving. She put the rifle down. She slept. Day 3 brought rain. Not the sideways Pacific variety, but a North Carolina persistent rain, the kind that settled in at ground level and refused to negotiate. By the time the first phase briefed, visibility below 500 yards was clear, and above it was increasingly theoretical. And the 3 competitors who had built their systems around laser range finding were quietly recalibrating their expectations, because laser rangefinders and precipitation had a complicated relationship. Quinn had no laser rangefinder. She had eyes and judgment and 26 years of her grandfather's instruction in what he called honest distance, which was what you knew about how far something was when you had nothing to help you but what you'd learned about how far things were. The day's primary scored challenge was announced at 0715. 5 shots, unknown distances between 500 and 1,000 yards, called at the moment of engagement. Rain conditions, wind variable, group score by proximity, not ring value. 7 competitors requested a weather modification. It was within their rights. They were credited with the points available from the previous day's total and moved to a covered position to wait. Quinn went to lane 9. She went prone in rain that immediately found its way through every gap in her layers and introduced itself to her skin with the specific intimacy of serious weather. She had been in worse. She had made shots in worse. She thought about her grandfather in the mountains in winter with conditions that made this rain seem like an inconvenience. The first distance was called at 600 yards. She found the target. Through iron sights, in rain, at 600 yards, the target was a shape in gray that required interpretation rather than observation. She read the wind from the way the rain moved across her field of view, from the pressure against the left side of her face, from the micro-adjustments her body was already making to compensate. She held. She felt the rhythm of the gusts. Between a gust and its successor, in the half-second of relative calm, she fired. The scoring came back by radio from the downrange station. Center. She cycled the bolt and waited for the next distance call. 800 yards. She fired inside the wind, center. 900 yards. She took longer, not because she was uncertain, but because 900 yards in these conditions required her to factor elements that didn't have names in any manual. The specific gradient of the rain's angle, the way the target moved in the visual field at the edge of resolution, the accumulated feel of everything she knew about 900-yard shots, distilled into a single moment of synthesis. She fired. Center. The range was very quiet, not the quiet of a managed facility observing protocol. The quiet of people who have stopped doing their own things to pay attention to someone else's. Fenwick, 2 lanes left, had scored center adjacent at 800 and an edge head at 900. Fenwick was excellent. He was performing exactly as well as his record suggested he could in these conditions. It was not what was happening in lane 9. 1,000 yards. At 1,000 yards in rain with variable wind and iron sights. The mathematics of the shot existed in a space beyond technical calculation. This was not a solvable equation. It was an act of translation between what the body knew and what the physics required, and the only way it worked was if the body had been taught correctly and the teaching had gone deep enough that it lived below thought. Quinn's grandfather had taught her to shoot at 1,000 yards for the first time when she was 17. On a clear Pennsylvania morning with no wind, and she had missed 3 times before she understood what she was missing. Not technically, philosophically. She had been thinking about the distance instead of inhabiting it. She had been calculating instead of knowing. He had stood behind her and said nothing for 20 minutes while she figured it out. When she hit the 4th shot, he had said, "There it is." Just that. She had been trying to put words to what "there it is" meant ever since. The closest she had come, the moment when the distance stops being a variable and starts being a fact. When you stop estimating and start knowing. When the shot stops being something you're attempting and it becomes something you're completing. She fired. The radio from the downrange station was silent for 5 seconds, long enough that the man on Garvey's right said something under his breath. Then, hit. Dead center. What happened on the observation deck above her was not organized. It was the involuntary response of multiple people simultaneously encountering something they needed time to believe. A burst of sound that lasted 3 seconds and then cut itself off because they remembered where they were. Major Whitmore was at the railing with a pair of binoculars. She lowered them slowly. She turned to the officer beside her. "Pull the Avery file," she said. "The full one." The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The full service record includes several classified deployments." "I have clearance," Whitmore said. "Pull it." She put the binoculars back up. Below, Quinn was already waiting for the next distance call. Garvey, 15 years of running precision ranges and the specific emotional neutrality of a man who had seen nearly everything, stood at his scoring position and looked at his clipboard and looked at the range and said to nobody in particular, quietly, "Lord have mercy." That evening, the board showed Quinn in first, Fenwick second, O.C. third. Bray was 5th behind a ranger whose name Quinn hadn't marked at the start because she hadn't needed to. She passed Bray in the equipment staging area. He said nothing. She said nothing. But she noticed the quality of his silence, which was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was something more compressed, more pressurized. The silence of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't expect to be and hasn't decided yet what to do about it. She filed that away. Her grandfather had told her once that the most dangerous moment is not when someone opposes you openly. It's when someone who has been opposing you goes quiet. Because quiet means they've moved from argument to planning. She went to her quarters, cleaned the rifle, and slept. She found the note on day 4. It wasn't a threatening note. That was what made it considered. It was a printout of the invitational rules, specifically the section on equipment inspection protocol, with a single line highlighted in yellow. Any equipment found to fail specification inspection during the competition period will result in immediate disqualification. It had been slid under her door sometime in the night. She sat with it for a moment. Then she dressed, walked to the range administration office, and found Garvey already at his desk at 0530. She set the note in front of him. He looked at it. He read it. His jaw moved once in the specific way of a man keeping something inside that wants to come out. "When did you find this?" "This morning," she said. "Under my door? In your equipment locker?" "It was unlocked again last night. Nothing removed, but repositioned. Same as before." He was quiet for a long time. "Captain Avery," he said, and she noticed that he used her rank, which he hadn't before, which meant something had shifted in how he was processing this. "I want to tell you something before the morning briefing. I found something 2 days ago that I've been investigating through proper channels rather than telling you about immediately, and I want you to understand why I waited." She waited. The facility key log shows your locker number accessed, twice outside your logged access times. The access came from a key assigned to the facility logistics coordinator. That coordinator is currently on administrative hold, pending a conversation with the Post Inspector General. He paused. There's a second name in the communication records. Someone who contacted the logistics coordinator. We're still building the documentation, but the directional signal is strong, Quinn said. Yes, he said. She thought about her grandfather's note to her, handwritten on an index card in his careful watchmaker's script, which she kept in her wallet. What other people do to undermine you says nothing about you and everything and about them. Your job is to make sure it doesn't get into your hands. Don't let it into your hands. What happens now? She said. The investigation continues, Garvey said. In the meantime, I want you to know that your equipment passed spec inspection this morning. He paused. I inspected it myself an hour ago. She looked at him. I also want you to know that the Inspector General's office will be on facility grounds for today's phase. He held her gaze. The competition proceeds. Your scores stand. Nobody touches your equipment from this point forward. She stood. Thank you. Chief, don't thank me, he said, the same words Osi had said. She was starting to understand that they were the words men said when they had done what was right and didn't want credit for it because the doing was the point. She walked back to the range. Day 4's primary challenge was wind, not metaphorically, literally. A crosswind that had developed overnight and was running at a sustained 22 miles per hour with gusts to 38, coming from the northwest with the specific unhelpfulness of a wind that shifted 5 to 8 degrees in direction every 12 seconds without pattern. The kind of wind that made ballistic computers iterate through calculations faster than they could confirm them, and made experienced shooters look at their data and then look at the range and then make a choice about which one they trusted. Quinn looked at the range. She felt the wind on her left cheek. She noted the way the grass at the target berms moved, and the way it moved slightly differently at 400 yards versus 700 versus 900, because terrain affected wind the way it affected everything, with variations that sensors located at a single point couldn't capture. She went to her lane and lay down. The day's scored challenge was a mixed sequence. 6 targets at distances called in real time, wind variable, no announced order. The shooter who scored highest won the day's points allocation. There were no partial credits. You hit or you missed. Bray was in lane 7. She could see him in her peripheral awareness. He had his scope dialed and redialed 3 times before the first target appeared. The turrets, clicking with the controlled urgency of someone trying to get ahead of conditions that were moving faster than the equipment could track. The first target appeared at 500 yards. Quinn read the wind in the way she had learned to read it, not as a measurement but as a presence, the way you read the mood of a room when you walk in. She felt where it was going. She held the front post in the space where the target would be when the bullet arrived, which was not the same as where the target was when she fired. She fired, hit. The wind shifted 4 degrees before the second target appeared. She felt it shift. She didn't check an instrument. She felt it the way her grandfather had felt it in Winter Mountains 60 years earlier, when feeling it was the only option available and feeling it had to be enough. Second target, 700 yards. Hit. Third target, 900 yards. The wind gusted to 38 as the target appeared. She waited. Not long. 3 seconds. The gust dropped back to baseline. She fired in the window. Hit. The range was doing that thing again. The thing where the individual sounds of a working range, breath, equipment adjustment, quiet professional conversation, gradually went silent around a particular lane because what was happening in that lane had become more important than anything else. She heard Bray's 4th shot come back as a miss. Not close. The wind had moved during his firing sequence, and his computer had given him a number that was correct for the conditions 2 seconds before he fired and wrong for the conditions when the bullet was in flight. The difference between 2 seconds and 900 yards was not forgiving. She fired her 4th shot. Hit. By the end of the sequence, Quinn had gone 6 for 6. Fenwick had 5. Osi had 5. Bray had 3, which under any other circumstances, in any other field, would have been a strong performance in these conditions. Today, it was posted below 3 other names on the board. And the name at the top was not the name anyone in this facility had expected to be at the top when the week began. That evening, Major Whitmore called her to the administrative building. The office was a standard post building, the kind that smelled like government issue cleaning solution and old paper, with a window that faced the range and a desk that held 2 files instead of 1. Whitmore gestured to the chair across from her and sat down and was quiet for a moment in the manner of a woman organizing her thoughts carefully before she delivered them. "Captain Avery," she said, "how much do you know about your grandfather's service record?" The question arrived in the room with weight. Quinn felt it in her chest, the specific pressure of something that has been waiting in the background of your life for a long time suddenly occupying the foreground. "I know what he told me," she said. "And what his discharge papers say, which is that he served with distinction." She paused. "That's the official language. He never told me more than that, and I never pushed." Whitmore turned one of the files. "Your grandfather's full service record," she said, "was requested from the National Personnel Records Center 48 hours ago on my authorization. What I found when I read it was not what I expected." Quinn said nothing. On the night of November 14th, 1951, Whitmore said, "In the Tabac Mountains, your grandfather, then Private First Class Russell Callum, held a defensive position alone for 4 hours while 3 wounded men sheltered behind his line, and a 4th was extracted by a medical team that couldn't reach the position until 0230. She paused. "His weapon functioned in conditions that caused 3 other weapons in his unit to fail. He engaged at distances that the after-action report described as extreme for available equipment." She stopped. His commanding officer noted that his performance was, and I'm quoting the official document, "instrumental in the survival of 4 personnel." The room was quiet. "He was recommended for the Bronze Star," Whitmore said. The recommendation was submitted on November 20th, 1951. It was received at battalion headquarters and logged. After that, it was referred to a review board for corroboration. She looked at Quinn. 2 of the 4 men who survived that night were medically evacuated within a week. The 3rd was transferred to a different unit. There was no officer present at the action who survived in the same command structure to confirm the recommendation. Quinn heard herself say, "So it was denied." "Delayed," Whitmore said. "The official language is administratively delayed, but the practical effect was that the recommendation was in a file in a series of offices for 3 years, and by the time anyone followed up, the unit had disbanded, and there was no one left to confirm the context." She paused. "It wasn't lost. It was buried under the weight of a bureaucracy that wasn't designed to keep track of things that didn't have an advocate keeping track of them for it." The silence between them had a specific quality, the quality of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being said out loud to the right person. "Why are you telling me this?" Quinn said. Her voice was steady. She had not expected her voice to be steady. She was grateful for it. "Because I've watched what you've done on this range for 4 days, Whitmore said. "And because I pulled his file, and I understand now what I'm watching. You're not just shooting well. You're executing what he taught you with the equipment he carried, with the methods he developed under conditions that most people in this building can't fully imagine." She was quiet for a moment. "And because I believe that his record deserves to be complete before I finish this week and move on to other business, I've been in contact with the Army Review Board's agency. There are provisions for reviewing historical recommendations where documentation exists to support the original commendation." Quinn looked at the file, at her grandfather's name on a document from 1951, Russell Arthur Callum. She had known that name her entire life. She had known it in the context of a man with a watchmaker's hands and a good laugh and a rifle he kept oiled in a wooden case in the hall closet. She had not known it in the context of a November night in the mountains in Korea, where those same hands had held a line alone for 4 hours so that other people could survive. He had never told her. He had given her the rifle instead, and in giving her the rifle, he had told her everything. "What happens after the review?" she said. "If the documentation supports the recommendation, and based on what I've read, I believe it does, the award would be confirmed and issued. The record would be corrected." Whitmore paused. He would have the citation his commanding officer believed he had earned. Quinn was quiet for a long moment. "He's 87, she said. "I know," Whitmore said. "That's why I'm moving this through channels today, before the competition ends, so that when you go home, something is already in motion." Quinn looked at the file, and then at the window, and then at the range outside, where the wind flags were still moving and the target frames were still standing patient in the late light. She thought about a phone call she would make to a house in western Pennsylvania. She thought about what his voice would sound like when she told him. She thought about the laugh he had, which was a good laugh for an 87-year-old man, and which she suspected she was about to hear in a context neither of them had ever imagined. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in the full sense. Not just for the information, for the act of looking. She picked up the rifle and walked back to the range. The final day arrived clean, the way final days arrive when everything has already been decided and all that remains is the execution. The storm from 3 days earlier was memory. The sky was the specific blue of autumn mornings in the Carolinas that felt like an apology for every overcast day that preceded it. Quinn was awake at 0430. She sat with the rifle in the dark for 40 minutes and she did not rehearse. She did not run scenarios or visualize the phases. She thought about her grandfather, about his hands, about what 3 winters in the mountains had cost him and what he had brought home despite the cost, about the fact that he had handed her a rifle at 8 years old and started, in that moment, a process he probably didn't have words for, the process of making her into the proof that what he knew was worth knowing. The final phase was the championship challenge. Garvey announced it at SO 800 with the specific low drama of a man who has designed something and trusts the design to speak for itself. Cumulative fire, a sequence of shots beginning at 400 yards and extending 100 yards with each subsequent shot, no resetting between distances. 1 shot per distance. Maximum distance. Wolfdean 400 yards. The room received this information in the manner of people who have done math in their heads and found the answer uncomfortable. 1,400 yards in open competition was the kind of distance that separated theoretical capability from actual capability. At 400 yards, the variables accumulated past the point where computation was reliable. Wind drift at that distance required either extraordinary equipment or extraordinary knowledge. Electronic systems could help narrow the margins. They could not eliminate the fundamental requirement, which was the ability to read conditions that were still changing after you had calculated them. Quinn went to lane 9. She went prone. She cleared her mind the way her grandfather had taught her to clear it, which was not by emptying it, but by filling it completely with the present moment, until there was no room left for anything else. 400 yards. The front post, the aperture, the target, the light, the breath, the pause between breaths, the trigger, center, 500 yards. The wind had come up slightly from the east, steady enough to be predictable. She adjusted her hold and fired in the middle of her natural respiratory pause. Center, 600 yards. Center, 700 yards. A gust moved through. She waited for it to pass and fired in the calm behind it. Center, 800 yards. The distance where, with iron sights in a crosswind, the margin for error was measured in fractions that had no name in any manual. She felt the fraction. She fired. Center, 900 yards. The observation deck above the range had been filling since the 700-yard shot. She could hear the footsteps. She did not look up. Looking up was a thing you did when you needed to be seen. She needed to shoot. 1,000 yards. The threshold where, in her experience, a shot stopped being a calculation and became a conversation with everything she'd learned. She had the conversation. Center, 1,100 yards. Center, 1,200 yards. She paused longer here, not from doubt, from respect. 1,200 yards was not to be rushed. It required the specific quality of patience her grandfather called honest waiting, which was different from hesitation. Hesitation was fear wearing patience's clothes. Honest waiting was the knowledge that the right moment was coming and the discipline to not fire before it arrived. It arrived. She fired. Center, 1,300 yards. She felt something she hadn't felt in competition before. Not pressure. Something more like arrival. The sense that the last 26 years, every dawn in Pennsylvania with frost on the grass, every deployment, Every moment of being told she was wrong about what she could do had been converging on this lane, this range, this distance. The accounting, as she had thought of it, was about to be settled. She fired. The radio from the downrange station was silent for 4 seconds. Center. 1,400 yards. She repositioned. She settled. She thought about her grandfather's hands over hers on the stock of this rifle when she was 8 years old, the first time, his patience so complete it felt like a physical thing, a weight she could lean against. She thought about what he'd said when she was 12 and had asked him why he'd given her this rifle instead of a newer one. He'd said, "Because this one knows what it's for, and now you'll know too." She had not understood that at 12. At 34, prone on a Carolina range at 400 yards, with 11 center shots behind her and one still in front of her, she understood it completely. She breathed out. In the pause between the exhale and the inhale, in the moment when the body is briefly still enough to be trusted with something important, she broke the trigger. The bullet traveled for approximately 1.9 seconds. The radio crackled, hit, dead center. What happened on the observation deck was not professional. It was not organized. It was the response of human beings who have been holding their collective breath without coordination and release it simultaneously. A sound that moved through the facility and was heard in buildings that had no reason to be listening, and the people in those buildings came to their windows, and some of them walked out to see what was happening, and what was happening was a woman from western Pennsylvania lying prone on lane 9 with her grandfather's rifle, having just done something at 4,400 yards that most of the people present would describe for the rest of their professional lives as the finest shot they had ever witnessed. Major Whitmore gripped the railing of the observation deck. She turned to the officer beside her. "Get the ceremony room ready," she said. Quinn stood. She cleared the chamber. She held the rifle at her side and looked at the range and thought about her grandfather. And she thought that wherever you kept the people who had made you, that was where he was right now, and that he knew. Osi was waiting for her at the staging area. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has temporarily run out of the composure he'd spent 20 years building. 1,400 yards, he said. "He taught me at 1,000 first," she said. "This was the progression." He shook his head slowly. "He made me ready before I knew I'd need to be," she said. The ceremony was held at 1900 in the formal assembly room, and by the time it began, every chair was full and men were standing along the walls and in the hallway outside, and the room had the quality that rooms have when something has happened that everyone present understands they will be asked about for the rest of their careers. Quinn stood at the front in dress uniform. The rifle was in her left hand. She had asked permission to hold it, and no one had said no. Whitmore spoke without notes. 4 days ago, she said, a woman walked onto this range with a rifle that her grandfather carried in Korea in 1951, attached nothing to it, and proceeded to do something with it that the best-equipped marksman in the American military could not replicate. She looked at the room. "I have been in this uniform for 28 years. I have seen exceptional performance. I have never seen what I saw on Lane 9 this week." The room was silent. "But this week was not about shooting," she said. "Shooting was the vehicle. What this week was about was the question of what produces shooting of that quality, and the answer is not equipment. The answer is not technology. The answer is a man who spent 3 winters in Korean mountains learning what iron sights could do that nothing else could, and who came home and spent the next 60 years teaching his granddaughter every single thing he knew." She looked at Quinn. "Private First Class Russell Arthur Callum," she said, "was recommended for the Bronze Star in 1951 for actions that saved 4 lives in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. That recommendation was administratively delayed and never completed. That failure belongs to the institution, not to him." She paused. "Tonight, on behalf of the United States Army, and with the authorization of the Adjutant General, I am initiating the formal correction of that record. The Bronze Star is being issued to Russell Arthur Callum of Carnegie, Pennsylvania, age 87, who has been waiting 63 years without complaint, and who, in lieu of complaint, gave his rifle to his granddaughter and taught her to use it." She held out the case. Quinn stepped forward. Her eyes were dry. Her hands were steady. Her grandfather's rifle was in her left hand, and the bronze star was placed in her right hand, and she held both of them and felt the weight of both of them, and understood that the weight was not separate things but one thing, the same thing that had been carried from a mountain in Korea through a house in Pennsylvania to a range in North Carolina over the course of 63 years. Moving through the way important things moved, not in straight lines, not without loss, but forward, always forward, toward the moment when someone with the authority to say so finally said, "This was real, and it mattered, and we owe the man who did it the acknowledgement we failed to give him when we should have." She pressed the metal against her chest. She thought about calling him. She already knew what his voice would sound like. She already knew what he would say. He would say he didn't need it. And she would tell him that she knew, and that it was coming anyway, and that the men who needed it to be on paper were the ones who had been wrong about him all along. He would laugh. He had a good laugh for an 87-year-old man. The room rose without a signal, without coordination, each person arriving at the same moment through their own route. And the sound they made together was the sound of people honoring something real, which is a sound unlike any other sound, because it has no performance in it, only recognition, and recognition, when it is genuine and long overdue, carries a weight that fills every room it enters completely. Quinn stood at the front of it and held the rifle and the metal and let it move through her without trying to contain it. Her grandfather had not stood in this room. He had never needed to. He had been in every shot she fired since she was 8 years old, in the hands she had inherited that knew the feel of this stock, in the eyes she had trained to see what iron sights showed you when you trusted them, in the patience she had built from his patience, in the knowledge she carried that he had carried first. He was here. He had always been here. The metal caught the light,